Yeah. So first, just real quick, can you tell everyone again the different formats of the app, the different versions? It's an iPad, it's an ebook.
Yeah,
Anything
it's
else?
well, uh, it's in several different forms. We made an ebook, which you'll find on our website, which is a narrative that'll walk you through uh, in well-written prose what I just ran through in like lightning fast language. And I think the story in itself is a really interesting story. So I don't know if you have time to get your students to read through the book, but for your own prep and teaching this unit, it's really a quick read that would give you a lot of background. We made an app for the iPad probably now about 8 or 9 years ago. We made it because we had that Senate markup and we were really banging our heads against the wall thinking, we know this is a great teaching tool. What's the best way to bring it into the classroom? So we thought we could make an app that would allow you to see the layers of information and the layers of history that are encoded in that document. So essentially, the thought behind the app was, what would you have to know to really savor this document as a historical source? And we tried to put in the app all the information that would help you as a teacher and your students really see how cool the story is of Congress creating the Bill of Rights. Well, then, that was when the Apple iPad was new and we thought everybody would have an Apple iPad. Well, it didn't work out that way. So then we went back and had a PDF version made. And the PDF version gives you, your way to go in and get it for everything else. Even those little phones, you can open it up on your phone and look at it. But we just don't have the funding to make additional versions. People ask, are you going to have an Android version and all that? And the answer is, well, we just can't get funding for that. But we do have the PDF, which seems to be the most universally useful.
Okay, terrific. And we put the links for that on the chat so everybody can find it. And it's in the handout that Charlie prepared that's on Google
Mm-hmm.
Classroom as well. Don Hoover asked a good question. You did this neat exercise, which I think a lot of the teachers do with their students, linking the grievances in the Declaration of Independence to the Bill of Rights. And how conscious do you think that process was for the framers of, the members of Congress at the time? I mean, do you think, is there evidence or that they actually are thinking in those terms, or do you just think this is part of the political culture at the time?
Well, that's Denver. This could be the subject of a book. I mean, that's a big question, Don. But I'll give you a very simple answer to it. Okay, so I think the answer is that it was part of the political culture of the time, which means they were thinking about it, and it was, but not thinking about it in the same way. And what you have to realize is that the first congressional elections were won by the Federalists. So the House of Representatives and the Senate were almost, not quite, but almost exclusively Federalists. There were a couple of anti-Federalists in each chamber. So the way they were thinking about this conversation was different from how the anti-Federalists were thinking about it. I think the Federalists in general were more trusting of the federal government to not abuse its constitutional powers. And I think they were more reliant upon the states to be the protectors of rights. And so they thought that state Bill of Rights were probably the right answer. The anti-federalists, I guess you could say, were truer to the revolutionary zeal of the decades earlier. So the things that they were passionate about in the 1770s, they seem to have kept their passion for. They were very much mistrustful of how this newly created federal government was going to stay within the bounds of the Constitution. If you don't have explicit like walls around it, won't it expand its power? And so I think that when you read what the people who were in the Congress and the debates, the anti-federalists were really, really strident, and they were, saying, no, we need to have all these different limits on government. And the Federalists were basically saying, hey, will you guys chill out? We don't need to do this. And that shows the political genius of James Madison, though, that he understood he had to negotiate some middle ground, even though he could never satisfy the anti-federalists. Thomas Tudor Tucker dismissed Madison's handiwork. The Bill of Rights as whip syllabub, meaning just frothy nothing. But by staying patient and staying with this project and pushing these moderate amendments through, Madison took that bit of political culture and found something that Federalist and Anti-Federalist could agree on. Because, you know, if you don't, how can you sustain a government? And so anyway,
Yeah.
that's my take on it.
No, it's
Denver, though, I would like to hear what you would say, because I know you'd have a much more informed answer of that.
No, I think you answered that well. I think the Anti-Federalists are really underappreciated, right?
Yeah.
And it begins with their name, right? It's never good to be the anti-anything. And it was the Federalists, of course, that called them the Anti-Federalists. And the Anti-Federalists said, we're actually the true Federalists. You're the nationalists. And
That's true.
So I wonder, I mean, in doing this project, did you, did your appreciation for the Anti-Federalists grow? And do you think that that's, something that, maybe needs to spread more, that even today, maybe they don't get the recognition that they're due?
Well, I think that it's problematic, because when you look at history, there are some big questions about government that are present in this debate, and they don't go away. Like, how much power should the federal government have versus the states, and what things should the federal government take on, and what things should the states take on? How much power should the federal judiciary have? That was a central concern of Anti-Federalists. And, so all these issues stay around in American history. And so you can't really, I'm not able to have a definitive answer and say, yeah, the Anti-Federalists were right or wrong or something, because it's the beginning of a long conversation. What's really interesting to me about it is that ultimately they agreed to compromise. And I think for kids today to see how people would, in the interest of the public good, give up some of the points that they were really passionate about and find common ground with people they really didn't agree with. That's like an example. And that example is there in the 1780s. That example is not there 50 years later as we're moving toward the Civil War. And so, you really get a chance to get kids to think about what is citizenship and what is the public good versus the partisan interest. And so anyway, that's how I see it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so much was at stake. And I think in sort of teaching this compromise, if you think about it in world history terms, how successful the American Revolution has been compared to so many other revolutions in history, I think one reason is there's not a permanent opposition, a permanent political opposition, right? The Anti-Federalists, they don't run to the hills and wage, an ongoing guerrilla war against the government or anything. And that's because there was that process of compromise. And then the great thing is, once they get the Bill of Rights, they're the biggest defenders of the Constitution, right? The ones that, become Jeffersonians. And it's kind of an amazing process.
It is, but it really underscores, I think, how government by the people is a cultural institution.
Yeah.
And the buy-in, the belief in that institution as itself as a cultural value becomes like what really keeps America together.
Absolutely. So we want to turn to the documents. One last question that came in that's really a good one. All of the historic events that have just happened in this year and the last couple of years with movements like the Black Lives Matter movement, different social protests. How do you what kind of advice might you have for the teachers in teaching things like the Bill of Rights against the backdrop of events today?
Well, I think to keep, again, a big question, I'll give a short answer to. I go to the first words of the Constitution, we the people. And what I ask the students and teachers to think about is, who was included in that phrase at the time when the Bill of Rights was being debated. I mean, we're talking about limits on government, but a good number of Americans were under the thumb of unlimited authority because they were enslaved. And so, it wasn't a republic for everybody. For whom did that promise ring true? And it was a small number in 1789. And what you can look at the American story then in terms of is, where is that discussion at various points in history? How big is the circle of people who are included within the phrase, we the people? With emancipation, does it grow? But then you got things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, Plessy Ferguson, the Jim Crow era. What's happening to that promise? Then you get things like the women's movement and the 19th Amendment. And, you go forward to the civil rights movement. And so what you can see is that America isn't a static thing. It's this ongoing experiment. And the reason I would look at it that way is because the real challenge to your students is to ask them, okay, what's next? Where is that discussion today? And, you know, so with the Black Lives Matter and this, then the structural racism that is being debated in our times, the question is, are African Americans fully incorporated within the phrase "we the people"? And that's what people are, you know, debating in another way. And you know, what about gay rights? Are gay people fully included? What about handicapped people? Are they fully included in the phrase "we the people"? Do they have the same promise of American life? And so that gets your kids to see it not just a bunch of dead stuff in the past argued by dead white people, but the beginning of a conversation that's intensely vibrant and intensely important to us today. And you know, you can, it's a crummy conversation to be in because there's so much wrong with America when you look at it in some ways. But the other side of the coin is because we've inherited this legacy of government by the people, we have the capacity to address these issues by active citizenship. And so you can impress your kids the urgency of taking ownership of the country and the nation's future. So that's my response.
It's a great answer, a really great answer. And yeah, the American Revolution is still alive. We're still living in the frame of government that was created, right? So we're still sorting out what it all means, right? So this isn't just you know, the past for students, but it's the world we live in.
Yeah, a question that de Crèvecoeur asked in the 1790s: who is an American?
Yeah, yeah.
You know, we're still asking it.
Absolutely. Well, excellent. So why don't you introduce